Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a very serious and I think very thoughtful look at a crucial piece of future prophecy.
Mhm.
We're going to be talking about the geopolitical engine, really, that sets the stage for what the Bible calls the Tribulation period.
Hmm.
And we're going to try and move beyond just generalities and zoom in on a very specific political body, this 10-nation Confederacy,
Mhm.
and we'll be drawing strictly from, scholarly sources rooted in a dispensational premillennial view.
It's a real privilege to explore these texts. They require, I think, very careful study and a pastoral approach because we have to understand that these can be difficult topics for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
So our mission today is really clear. We want to clarify the scriptural basis, the timeline, and the very precise role of this alliance. We want to understand how this structure, paves the way for the rise of this global leader known as the Antichrist, grounding our discussions strictly in the details from the prophets Daniel and John.
When you read Revelation and Daniel, the sheer scale of the global events can feel, well, just overwhelming. But what our sources really highlight is that the rise of a global dictator isn't just a sudden event. It's actually facilitated by a very tactical, very specific political alliance.
Yes.
This confederacy isn't some footnote. It's the political lever that gives the Antichrist his initial authority.
That is absolutely key. That's the perfect word for it, a lever. This 10-nation structure is the incubator for his power, and it shows that God's prophetic timetable works through, well, real-world political developments. We're looking at how a new world order, a revived form of Gentile power, emerges from the ashes of existing structures. So the question for us today is, what does the Bible actually reveal about the makeup and the purpose of this incredibly powerful alliance?
Okay, so let's unpack that foundation because it's so important. This whole idea of 10 nations forming this powerful core alliance it's not an isolated guess from one verse. It comes from two major separate prophetic sources, Daniel in the Old Testament and then Revelation in the New. So why is having these dual witnesses separated by centuries so important for its weight in our understanding of the future?
The dual witness is vital. It's what gives this whole concept its credibility because it provides both historical context and later explicit identification. Daniel, writing from within the Babylonian and Medo-Persian empires, he lays down the historical trajectory of Gentile world power, and he follows it all the way to its final phase.
Okay.
Then, centuries later, John, writing in exile under the Roman Empire, he confirms that exact same pattern, and then he details its final application in the end times. So when the blueprint from Daniel aligns so perfectly with the final description in Revelation, well, we have to view this 10-nation structure as central to God's plan for the final political stage.
Let's start with that blueprint then, in Daniel. I think we should focus on the historical progression of world powers, starting with Nebuchadnezzar's famous dream of the great statue.
Right. Daniel chapter 2. It details this magnificent but also terrifying statue, and each part, made of a different material, symbolizes a successive world power. You have the head of gold, which is Babylon.
Right, Babylon.
The chest and arms of silver for Medo-Persia, the belly and thighs of bronze, representing Greece, and then the legs of iron, which is Rome. And the prophetic significance for our discussion is that the final form of Gentile power will emerge directly from the remnants of those legs from Rome.
In that final stage, the part that's really relevant for the end times, is the feet and the toes of the statue. Daniel 2 describes them, and this is where that number 10 first shows up.
Precisely. The feet and toes are made of iron mixed with clay. This is the symbolic picture of the final form of global power. The iron represents strength, linking it directly back to the powerful Roman Empire, but the clay signifies weakness. It signifies an inability to permanently cohere. You just can't fuse iron and clay into a stable, unified whole.
So what is that mixture, that strength and weakness, iron and clay, what does that imply about this future kingdom?
It implies a state of inherent instability, but also terrifying resilience. It suggests that while this final form of Roman power will be strong enough to dominate the world, that's the iron, it will be inherently divided. It's unable to achieve a monolithic unity. That's the clay.
And the 10 toes.
The 10 toes themselves are understood to represent 10 future kings, or 10 nations, that arise in this final era. And so the scholarly consensus, which is anchored in this framework, views this as a revived Roman Empire, a final political structure that arises from the territories and the influence of historical Rome, but it suffers from this built-in internal political friction.
Which makes the whole structure politically volatile from the very beginning. But then Daniel chapter 7 seems to personalize this political instability by introducing the leader who actually exploits it.
Yes, Daniel 7 gives us a much closer look at the political drama. Daniel has another vision, this time of four great beasts. And again, the fourth beast is identified as the Roman Empire. It's described as dreadful and terrible, devouring the whole earth. And it is this beast that has the 10 horns.
The 10 horns mirroring the 10 toes.
Exactly. The 10 horns on this fourth beast explicitly symbolize 10 kings or nations that emerge from this final kingdom. But here's the drama. The introduction of what he calls the little horn in Daniel 7. This figure is the Antichrist, who rises up from among this alliance.
And the text says this little horn comes up and then uproots 3 of the first horns. So what does that, subduing 3 of the 10 kings, what does that tell us about the nature of this confederacy in its early days?
It tells us 2 critical things. First, the alliance, despite having this, unified goal of bringing global order, is plagued by internal rivalries. It reflects that iron mixed with clay nature. Not all 10 kings are on the same page about the direction or the leadership.
Okay, so there's dissent right away.
Right. And second, it shows that the Antichrist doesn't inherit his power, he seizes it. He is ruthless. He completely eliminates 3 of the leaders to establish his own unquestioned dominance over the remaining 7. And this act cements him as the supreme authority within the Confederacy, making it his initial power base from which he can then project global influence. The Confederacy is the mechanism, you could say, but the little horn is the master mechanic.
So if Daniel gives us that historical blueprint in that initial instability revelation, specifically John's vision, it gives us the absolute confirmation and, I think critically, the political motivation behind the whole alliance. We see the beast rising from the sea with 10 horns in Revelation 13, confirming the structure.
The continuity is just striking. But it's Revelation 17 that gives us the clearest, most explicit definition of this arrangement. It moves us past the symbolism into really concrete prophecy. We're looking at Revelation 17, verses 12 and 13.
And that passage states that the 10 horns are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but will receive authority for 1 hour with the beast.
Yeah.
Why is that description, have not yet received a kingdom? Why is that so important for our timeline?
It confirms that these are future kings, future heads of state whose political authority is reserved specifically for the time of the end. Their power isn't some long-standing historical sovereignty, it's a temporary mandate, symbolized by that phrase, 1 hour.
A brief but intensely significant period.
Exactly. A brief but powerful period during the tribulation. And it also tells us they consolidate their power base at the very same time that the Antichrist is rising. It's a parallel development.
And then comes the most pivotal detail. They willingly unite and will give their power and authority to the Antichrist. This isn't a reluctant submission after, a military defeat. This is a voluntary ceding of sovereignty.
It's astonishing political compliance, and this is where the deep dive becomes so necessary. Why? I mean, why would 10 sovereign nations or 10 powerful leaders just voluntarily dissolve their own independent national authority and place it all into the hands of one man?
Right.
Our sources suggest the context has to be some kind of extreme global crisis, mass disillusionment with existing democratic systems, maybe an economic collapse far beyond anything we've ever seen, and then you have the political void created by the rapture.
So these nations, they don't see him as a threat, at least not initially. They see him as the only solution. The charismatic, cunning leader who promises immediate and total stability in a world that is just tearing itself apart.
Precisely.
So they're basically buying peace and order at the cost of their national identity.
Exactly that. They see him as this charismatic savior who can bring order, especially to the perpetually volatile Middle East. This alliance lets them pool their resources and political capital, and they probably believe they'll retain some influence. But at the end of the day, they are giving him the centralized power base he needs to go from being a regional leader to a global dictator. And they'll realize it far too late that they've empowered their own master.
We've established the who and the why based on that scriptural foundation. So now let's get into the practical chronology. When and how does this alliance move from being a prophetic prediction to a real operational political force? What do the sources say about the timing of its formation, say, relative to the start of the 7-year tribulation?
The formation is placed definitively at the very beginning of that 7-year period, likely in the first half, if not immediately preceding it. And as the sources note, there's strong speculation that the rapture of the church provides the catastrophic catalyst for this.
I mean, millions of people suddenly vanishing would create not just religious panic, but an immediate unfillable political, logistical, and economic chasm.
Absolutely. The world would demand an explanation and even more urgently, instant leadership and a total restructuring. The Antichrist, who is already a prominent figure and the emerging leader of this 10-nation structure, he just steps right into that void.
He's the man of the hour.
He is. He's adept at diplomacy. He's charismatic. He unites these 10 diverse nations through political and economic agreements, maybe promising shared prosperity, control of resources, mutual defense, the classic foundation of any powerful geopolitical bloc.
So he uses this alliance as his political shield and his sword. It validates him on the world stage and makes him a credible figure, someone capable of solving these huge international crises.
Precisely. This alliance makes him a force to be reckoned with, and he leverages that massive new power base to achieve the single most important diplomatic victory of his career, the treaty that formally begins the countdown to Christ's return.
Okay, this brings us to Daniel 9.27, the prophetic starting gun. This treaty is the event that officially kicks off the 7-year tribulation. And given that this is a point that is so frequently confused, I think we have to be absolutely clear, based on our source material, on who the parties are here and what the role of the 10-nation Confederacy is in brokering it.
Yes, this is a vital point of clarification. Daniel 9.27 says that he will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7, which means 7 years. The he is the Antichrist. The covenant is the peace treaty. The common mistake that's often made is assuming Israel is one of the 10 nations in the Confederacy, which, according to the sources, is incorrect.
So what is the exact nature of the relationship then? How does it work?
The Antichrist uses the massive political and military weight of his 10-nation Confederacy, this revived, powerful Western bloc, to broker the treaty. Israel is not one of the 10 nations in the Confederacy, but is rather the central recipient of the guaranteed security.
Oh, okay, so they're the beneficiary.
They are the beneficiary. The treaty effectively guarantees Israel's safety in a hostile region, and it's enforced by the power of the Antichrist and his allied nations.
This makes the Antichrist appear as the ultimate peacemaker, doesn't it? The one who finally solved this seemingly intractable Middle East crisis.
Absolutely. The treaty is a guarantee of security. And the pivotal concession that makes this guarantee so palatable to Israel is that it allows them to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem and reinstate sacrifices.
Wow.
The Antichrist is presenting stability, and he's leveraging the power of this alliance to enforce that guarantee. This is the act that confirms his rise and officially starts that 7-year prophetic clock ticking.
That clarity is so essential. So the 10 nations are the political backbone that makes the guarantee possible, and that allows the Antichrist to position himself as the world's indispensable diplomat.
And this consolidation has to happen rapidly. The first half of the tribulation, the first 3.5 years, is characterized by the Antichrist eliminating any of his remaining domestic rivals, the 3 kings from Daniel 7,
Right.
solidifying his 10-nation core, and just basking in the worldwide acclaim he gets from brokering this incredible peace treaty. The foundation for his ultimate dictatorship is laid right there during that period.
Okay, so we know the function and we know the timing are certain, but the scripture, and this is maybe frustrating for those of us who want a neat list, it doesn't provide a definitive list of names, like Italy, Greece, Portugal. So since this is a deep dive, we have to at least explore the informed speculation that dispensational scholars offer about the geography and the identity of these 10 nations.
The thoughtful speculation is exactly the right approach here. And we have to reiterate that we are focusing on the symbolic and functional significance, which is clear rather than on confirmed identities. The geographic focus, however, is intensely clear: the revived Roman Empire.
Okay, so this is the dominant theory, cited by prominent scholars like Walvoord and Fruchtenbaum. It's rooted in that historical progression from Daniel 2. What's the fundamental historical justification for believing that the final Gentile kingdom has to be a revival of Rome?
The justification is continuity. You see, Rome was never conquered and completely replaced in the same way that Babylon was replaced by Persia. Rome just fragmented. The territory and the influence just broke apart into the various nations of modern Europe and the Mediterranean.
It just dissolved.
It dissolved, and the historical prophetic view argues that God's plan requires the final world power to arise from those remnants, from those pieces of iron, demonstrating that Gentile dominance concludes exactly where it last stood, in the historical Roman sphere of influence.
So geographically, we're looking at nations that once fell under the dominion of the Caesars. So countries bordering the Mediterranean, extending into Western Europe, and possibly even North Africa.
Precisely. That gives us a clear regional focus. The final power structure has to reflect that fragmented but influential legacy. The 10 kings, therefore, are seen as a political consolidation of power in that historically significant region.
When you look at modern political structures that consolidate power in that region, I mean, the most common parallel that scholars draw is the European Union, the EU. It's a coalition of sovereign nations, often politically divided, but it wields massive economic force.
That parallel is conceptually very strong, yes. It represents a voluntary partial ceding of sovereignty for economic and political benefit. But we have to immediately add the caveat that's noted in our sources. The current number of EU member states far exceeds 10.
Right, so that means if the EU is the progenitor, we would have to anticipate some kind of significant political change, either a massive fragmentation or maybe a drastic reduction to a core group that maintains that iron strength.
Yes. The prophetic mandate of 10 requires either a splintering or the formation of an inner core that functions as the ruling alliance, perhaps driven by a financial crisis or a new military threat. So the speculation is centered on the potential of the EU structure to evolve into the required 10-nation framework.
But are there possibilities beyond just Western Europe? Since the peace treaty involves stability in the Middle East, could that pull nations from North Africa or the Near East into the Confederacy?
It absolutely raises that possibility. While the foundation is Roman, the strategic necessity of stabilizing the Middle East suggests that nations from North Africa or even parts of the Near East could be included in the 10. They might align for strategic geopolitical reasons, economic reliance, or simply the necessity of being on the winning side of a peace deal enforced by the Antichrist.
So it's a practical alliance.
It's very practical, and this is why some scholars include speculation about nations like Egypt or even potentially components of a reformed Ottoman sphere, although the consensus does remain heavily weighted toward that European core.
So for you listening, the ultimate takeaway is to watch the region and the nature of the consolidation, even if we can't name the flags yet. We are looking for a powerful but internally unstable alliance that arises from the former Roman sphere and leverages its power to dominate global affairs.
That is the function that is confirmed by prophecy. The names are secondary to the fact that this alliance will exist, and its sole purpose is to elevate the Antichrist to power.
You know, it would be easy to think that once the Antichrist has his 10-nation power base, the rest of the world just immediately falls in line. But Daniel 11 shows us that the tribulation period doesn't start with universal peace, but with major military challenges. This 10-nation group is not the only powerful player on the board. Let's introduce the concepts of the King of the North and the King of the South.
This is crucial context. The 10-nation group represents the consolidated power of the West, the Mediterranean region, under the Antichrist. But Daniel 11, which details conflicts in the time of the end, describes massive powers that remain distinct from the Confederacy and eventually oppose the Antichrist's initial rise.
So how does the prophetic geography of Daniel help us identify and locate these two major kings?
The key is Israel. Their identification is based purely on their geographical relationship to Israel. So the King of the North is commonly identified with a major power located directly north of Israel. Scholarly interpretation often points toward modern-day Russia, or maybe a large, possibly Islamic coalition of northern nations like Iran and Turkey, though Russia is very often seen as the chief figure.
And the King of the South, then, logically, lies south of Israel.
That's right. This power is typically associated with Egypt, potentially leading a strong coalition of North African nations. These are major regional forces. They're often vying for control of resources or access points like the Suez Canal, and they possess significant military capabilities.
So the Antichrist, leading his 10-nation alliance, has just brokered the world's most acclaimed peace treaty, guaranteeing security. Yet Daniel 11.40 describes an immediate, violent confrontation with these other kings.
The description is incredibly intense. Daniel 11.40 describes a military conflict where the king of the south will engage him, that is, the Antichrist in battle, and at the same time, the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships.
That's massive global warfare erupting almost immediately after the signing of a so-called peace treaty. What does this tell us about the strategic implications of this conflict on the Antichrist's rule?
It tells us the peace he promised is a facade. First, it shows the limits of the 10-nation Confederacy's initial power. They might control a large economic zone, but they do not control the entire world. And the powers in the North and South actively refuse to submit to the Antichrist's authority. They see his rise and the ensuing chaos as a moment of weakness, or maybe an opportunity to expand their own territory.
So what would be the Antichrist's necessary response to this kind of multi-front attack?
Well, he can't maintain his image as the great peacemaker if he's being invaded from two sides. This conflict forces his hand. It marks a transition from diplomat to militaristic dictator. He has to respond with overwhelming force to crush these challenges, which then justifies his totalitarian takeover later in the tribulation. This initial wave of military conflict, driven by the kings of the North and South, acts as the catalyst for the Antichrist to abandon diplomacy and embrace total militarism. And this leads directly to the events of the mid-tribulation.
That's a really important detail because it prevents us from viewing those first 3.5 years as just a time of quiet stability. The Confederacy is formed in chaos, and it's immediately plunged into global war.
Absolutely. The world will be unstable and violent, which makes the Antichrist's consolidation of power from regional leader to world dictator an increasingly urgent and brutal process. The conflict with the North and South is the pressure cooker that enables him to shift from ruling by consent, which is the consent of the 10 kings, to ruling by force over the entire world.
This political instability and the warfare of the first half of the tribulation, it brings us to that critical midpoint. And this is where everything changes. The Antichrist has used the 10-nation Confederacy to stabilize the West and broker the Israel Treaty. Now, having served its purpose, the Confederacy seems to just fade in significance as the Antichrist asserts his own unilateral power.
The 10-nation Confederacy's significance, it peaks in those first 3.5 years, and then it declines rapidly. Its primary role was strictly functional. It was there to provide the political, the economic, and the military platform necessary for the Antichrist to gain international prominence and to initiate that prophetic countdown with the treaty. Once he's fully established, the need for a cooperative alliance it vanishes.
So he moves from being a powerful leader who is supported by an alliance to a dictator who demands universal obedience and worship, and this marks the infamous abomination of desolation.
That is the defining shift. The midpoint is characterized by the Antichrist breaking his 7-year treaty with Israel, stopping the temple sacrifices, and then declaring himself to be God, sitting in the temple and demanding worship. It's foretold in 2 Thessalonians 2:4. He transitions from the political head of a coalition to a totalitarian figure exercising complete, ruthless control over all global systems, political, economic, and now religious.
And we see the clear scriptural confirmation of this global unilateral authority in Revelation 13.7.
The scope is total. Revelation 13.7 confirms that the Antichrist gains authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. This is the global culmination. His authority is now exercised far beyond the geographic limitations of his original 10 nations. He becomes a true world dictator.
And the 10 kings.
The 10 kings, who willingly gave him their power, believing they would retain influence, now find themselves as merely regional administrators in his vast global empire. Their initial sovereignty is, for all intents and purposes, dissolved.
It's a profound study in political short-sightedness. They empowered the one figure who would ultimately strip them of their own authority.
Indeed. It just demonstrates the dangerous allure of charismatic leadership during times of extreme crisis. The promise of order seems worth any cost until that order is weaponized against the very leaders who created it.
And even after their political power has waned, the 10 kings have one final, chilling act that's described in Revelation 17. They turn against and destroy the harlot. This brings in the whole concept of the false religious system of the end times.
This is one of the most remarkable and, I think, unexpected geopolitical shifts in the entire prophecy. The harlot in Revelation 17 represents the false composite religious system. It's the Antichrist's temporary religious partner that dominates the world during the early tribulation. This system likely incorporates elements of all world religions into a unified false worship structure, and it's separate from the political power of the 10-nation Confederacy.
So why did the 10 kings and the Antichrist suddenly turn on this system they've been working with?
Because by the midpoint, the Antichrist demands singular worship. He has no more need for a composite shared religious system. He wants to be the only God recognized globally. So the 10 kings, aligning with their master's new singular purpose, destroy the harlot. Revelation 17.2 sin says they will hate the harlot and will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. It's a violent, definitive destruction.
That sounds like a final, dark act of loyalty, demonstrating the total submission of the 10 kings to the Antichrist's will.
It is absolute submission, but Revelation 17:17 provides the deeper prophetic analysis. It says, "For God has put it into their hearts to accomplish his purpose." So even in this act of treachery and destruction, the 10 kings are fulfilling God's overarching sovereign purpose by executing judgment upon the false religious system. They're clearing the stage for the final events. Their utility is complete. Their role just fades into insignificance as the world awaits the final confrontation.
So the Confederacy is essentially a prophetic catalyst. It forms the platform, it initiates the countdown, it provides the initial muscle to execute the harlot, and then it just disappears into the background as the Antichrist takes the world to Armageddon.
That's the precise sequence. The prophetic spotlight shifts entirely to the Antichrist's final, globally centralized power structure, which leads inexorably to the climactic return of Christ.
This has been a really extensive exploration of a complex and frankly a serious prophecy. To summarize, this 10-nation confederacy is a critical yet temporary political structure. It's rooted deeply in Daniel and Revelation, and it serves as the initial platform for the Antichrist's ascent, enabling him to broker that pivotal peace treaty that triggers the final 7-year countdown.
And we clarified those crucial details. This alliance is likely based in the territory of the revived Roman Empire, suffering from that internal instability, the iron and clay. And we confirmed that Israel, while a key beneficiary of the treaty, is not one of the 10 nations. This entire political roadmap, while it sounds chaotic and frightening, is laid out with precision and is supported by key dispensational scholars like Walvoord and Fruchtenbaum.
When we focus on the complexity of world events, the rise and fall of dictators, the threat of global warfare, the instability of political alliances, it's natural for a thoughtful believer to feel a sense of anxiety about the immediate future.
And that is why the conclusion of our study has to pivot entirely away from the chaos of human politics to the certainty of divine control. Every geopolitical movement we've discussed, from the rise of the 10 kings to the destruction of the harlot, it all serves a sovereign purpose. This terrifying sequence of Gentile power is temporary and leads to only one ultimate victor.
That transition is perfectly captured by the closing passage in Daniel chapter 7. It comes right after the description of the 4 beasts and that destructive little horn. Daniel 7.27 provides the final, glorious contrast.
It says, "Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him."
What a profound promise. Despite the overwhelming power of the 10 nations and the Antichrist's global dictatorship, this passage anchors us in the ultimate truth. The sovereignty of God is not shaken. All earthly power structures are fleeting. They're merely serving to set the stage for Christ's eternal kingdom.
That is the sure hope that we derive from all prophecy. The story doesn't end with the chaos of the Antichrist. It ends with the certainty that Christ returns to establish a kingdom that knows no end. May you rest in the sovereignty and certainty of that coming everlasting kingdom.